There's $38 trillion sitting on the books right now that the US government technically owes, but will probably never pay back in any real sense. And before you roll your eyes and think this is another rant about politicians being fiscally irresponsible, which, yeah, they are, this is different because what's happening isn't a bailout or a default or even a policy mistake. It's a magic trick, a slow-motion financial sleight of hand that's been running for over a decade, and most people have no idea it's even happening. Here's the thing that should piss you off. They're not erasing this debt by paying it down. They're erasing it by making the number itself meaningless. And if that sounds insane, good, because it is. Let's start with what we're actually talking about. The U.S. national debt is around $38 trillion. That's the number everyone sees on the debt clock in Times Square, the one politicians scream about during election season, the one that makes your uncle at Thanksgiving go on a rant about how we're screwing future generations. And sure, he's not wrong, but he's also not seeing the full picture. Because here's what most people don't realize. A huge chunk of that debt isn't owed to China or hedge funds or your local bank. It's owed to the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, which is, for all practical purposes, the government owing money to itself. Now, if you just thought, wait, what the fuck? You're paying attention. This starts in 2008. The financial crisis hits, Lehman Brothers collapses, the global economy is on the edge of total meltdown. So the Federal Reserve does something it's never done before at this scale. It starts buying U.S. government debt. Trillions of dollars of it. They call it quantitative easing, QE for short. Sounds technical, sounds safe. What it actually means is the Fed is creating money out of thin air and using it to buy Treasury bonds from the government. Let me say that again. The Fed prints money, digitally but still, and hands it to the Treasury in exchange for IOUs. The Treasury takes that cash and spends it. Stimulus checks, bank bailouts, infrastructure, whatever. And now the Fed is holding trillions of dollars in government debt on its balance sheet. By 2014, the Fed owned about $4 trillion in assets. By 2022, after the pandemic spending binge, that number hit $9 trillion. Most of it, U.S. Treasury bonds. So the government borrows money, the Fed buys the debt, and the government uses that money to keep the economy from imploding. Seems like a neat trick, right? Except for one small problem. What happens when it's time to pay it back? Here's where it gets weird. In theory, the Fed is supposed to shrink its balance sheet eventually, sell those bonds back into the market, let the debt return to normal investors. But in practice, that's not really happening, at least not in any serious way. The Fed tried in 2018. They started unwinding QE, letting bonds mature without replacing them. The stock market threw a tantrum. Interest rates spiked. Within months, the Fed reversed course. They tried again in 2022. Same story, markets freaked out, inflation was already a nightmare. So they slowed down again. And here's the quiet part no one wants to say out loud. The Fed might never fully sell off that debt. Because if they did, it would flood the market with bonds, interest rates would skyrocket, borrowing costs would explode, and the entire economy would get absolutely screwed. So instead, they just hold it indefinitely, which means the U.S. government owes trillions of dollars to an institution that will probably never demand repayment. And even if the Fed did, it would just send the interest payments back to the Treasury anyway, because that's how the Fed works. Any profit the Fed makes gets returned to the government. You see the loop now? Let's do the uncomfortable math. As of late 2024, the Federal Reserve holds roughly $5 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. That's about 13% of the total national debt. Some estimates suggest that when you include other quasi-government entities like Social Security trust funds, which also hold government debt, nearly 40% of U.S. debt is effectively owed to itself. So when people freak out about $38 trillion in debt, they're not wrong. But they're also not entirely right, because a massive chunk of that debt exists in a weird financial limbo where it's technically real, but functionally irrelevant. It's like if you wrote yourself an IOU for $10,000, stuck it in a drawer, and then told everyone you were $10,000 in debt. Technically true, practically meaningless. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the Fed holds the debt forever. Problem solved, right? Not quite, because there's a cost to all this, and it's not the kind of cost that shows up on a balance sheet. First, inflation. When the Fed creates trillions of dollars to buy government debt, that money doesn't just vanish, it flows into the economy. And when you flood the system with cash while supply chains are broken and energy prices are spiking and everyone's still recovering from a pandemic, prices go up fast. We saw this in 2021 and 2022. Inflation hit 9%, the highest in 40 years. The Fed said it was transitory. It wasn't. Groceries got more expensive, gas got more expensive, rent got more expensive. And yeah, wages went up a little, but not nearly enough to keep pace. So in a very real sense, the government didn't erase the debt, it just transferred the cost to you. Every time you paid more for milk or eggs or a tank of gas, you were covering a tiny piece of that $38 trillion. Second, there's the trust issue. The whole reason U.S. debt works, the reason countries and investors around the world are willing to lend money to the U.S. government at relatively low rates, is because they trust it'll be paid back. U.S. Treasuries are considered the safest asset on the planet. The global financial system is built on that assumption. But what happens when the game becomes obvious? When foreign governments and investors realize that the Fed is just buying up debt indefinitely, that the U.S. is financing itself with printed money, that the whole system is held together by confidence and accounting tricks. Trust erodes, slowly at first, then quickly. We've already seen glimpses of this. China has been quietly selling off U.S. Treasuries for years. Other countries are exploring alternatives, trading oil in yuan, stockpiling gold, building payment systems that bypass the dollar. If confidence in U.S. debt collapses, interest rates would spike, the government's borrowing costs would explode, and that $38 trillion problem would become very, very real. Third, there's the philosophical question that no one wants to touch. If the government can just print money and buy its own debt, why does the debt even matter? Why do we pretend there's a limit? Why do we have these big, dramatic fights over the debt ceiling every few years if the Fed can just step in and make the problem disappear? The answer is, it does matter, but not in the way most people think. The debt matters because it represents resources the government has consumed. Real labor, real goods, real services. You can play accounting games all day long, but you can't print productivity. You can't print roads or hospitals or fighter jets. Those things require actual economic output. When the government borrows and the Fed buys the debt, what they're really doing is claiming a chunk of the economy's resources without directly taxing people for it. And in the short term, that works. But over time, if you keep doing it, you devalue the currency, you distort the economy, and you create a system where money itself starts to lose meaning. Here's the irony. The U.S. is doing this because it can, because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, because global markets still trust American debt more than any alternative, because the system is rigged in America's favor. But that advantage is also a trap, because the more the U.S. relies on this trick, printing money, buying its own debt, kicking the can down the road, the more fragile the whole structure becomes. Other countries are watching, they're learning, and some of them are betting that this can't last forever.
Let's zoom out for a second. This isn't just about the U.S. Japan has been doing a version of this for 30 years. The Bank of Japan owns nearly half of Japan's government debt. The European Central Bank has done massive bond buying programs. The UK, Canada, Australia, they've all played the same game. Central banks around the world have figured out that in a crisis, they can buy their own government's debt, stabilize markets, and keep the system running. And once you do it once, it's really hard to stop, because stopping means accepting pain, higher interest rates, slower growth, possible recession. So they keep going, and the debt keeps growing, and everyone pretends it's fine. Maybe it is fine. Maybe this is just the new normal. Maybe modern monetary systems are so complex and interconnected that old rules about deficits and debt just don't apply anymore. Or maybe we're all living in the longest, slowest financial experiment in history, and no one really knows how it ends. Here's what we do know. The U.S. national debt is $38 trillion and climbing. A big chunk of that is held by the Federal Reserve, which means it's functionally erased in any traditional sense. The government isn't paying it back, the Fed isn't demanding repayment,
And as long as inflation stays under control and global confidence in the dollar holds, the system keeps working. But that's a big if, because inflation isn't dead, it's just sleeping. And confidence isn't permanent, it's a collective hallucination that requires constant maintenance. The moment the market decides the debt actually matters, the moment foreign investors lose faith, the moment inflation spikes again and people start questioning whether dollars are even worth what they're supposed to be worth, that's when the magic trick falls apart. And here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to admit. We're not going back. The US isn't going to suddenly balance its budget. Politicians aren't going to slash spending. The Fed isn't going to unwind its balance sheet and return to some pre-2008 normal. This is the system now. Borrowing, printing, buying, holding. Rinse and repeat. The debt isn't being erased, it's being redefined, turned into something that exists on paper but doesn't constrain behavior. A number that grows every year but somehow never leads to consequences. Until it does. So maybe the real question isn't whether the US is erasing $38 trillion in debt. Maybe the question is, how long can you erase something before people notice it was never really there to begin with? And what happens when they do?